There we go.
Yeah,
Got it.
everyone knows. Everyone knows. Yeah. And I just want to say, I'm Elaine Henry, as if you don't know, but and this is Critical Connections, and I'd like to tell you that our goal is to encourage and enhance critical writing in ceramics with Critical Connections, our monthly meeting. And I want to thank you our donors. Linda Lighton is a major donor, and then most recently Diane Charnoff and Joe Loria have contributed. And our guest today is writer Nancy Servis. Nancy and I go back a little ways. She wrote quite a bit for us when I had Ceramics Art and Perception and Ceramics Technical. And I did send out her website. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Nancy.
Thanks, Elaine. And thank you everyone for coming. It's nice to see people or at least see their names. I don't think I've met everyone personally, but it's lovely to see you. And hopefully we'll maybe see each other sometime in the future, maybe at NCECA in Sacramento.
Right.
Yeah, so I'm the on-site conference liaison for that. And I've been working on that for 3 years, actually, 3.5 years. And we're getting to the point where it's pretty exciting and also a little scary. But anyway, hopefully we'll see each other then. So I'm just going to go ahead and start with my PowerPoint presentation. So let me know if you can't see my screen.
I'm going to ask everyone to mute so that we don't have interference.
Okay, so this is just a short presentation, and I feel like I'm almost preaching to the choir in a sense that many of you are accomplished writers in your own sphere and in your own way. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how I came to become a ceramics writer, and each person has their own path to that. And this is a little bit about what brought me to my place now as a well-documented ceramics writer or writer about artists who use clay. So I couldn't help myself but use this as a beginning. The early influences in Ohio. I was born and raised in Ohio, and I wasn't a Rod Serling fan per se, but the woman in the middle of the screen is my grandmother, and her name is Pearl Bentel. And you can see she's at a table with books that she has written. And she lived outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is where both of my parents are from, and became a writer in the 1940s for radio programs out of Pittsburgh. And it was because of her steadfast commitment to that she was able to do that for several years, because she was turned away because she was a woman, and her efforts were minimized in the eyes of many men. But she kept writing. So my mother and my father went to Antioch College, which is where they met, and another person went there as well, and that is Rod Serling. And once he realized that my mother's mother was a respected writer in Pennsylvania, he asked to be mentored by her. And I find this so amazing, because my grandmother's name, my sweet, dear, loving grandmother's name is Pearl, and she mentored this man who created many things, but this Twilight Zone we all know very well. And I find the lesson I found in that is that my grandmother was willing to go to a place to help someone, mentor them without judgment, and really fostered a creative mind that is now a public icon in our culture. The other image on the right side of the screen is a beautiful San Ildefonso plate and vessel. And the reason I say early influences in Ohio is because I often drove with my parents and my extended family from Ohio to Santa Fe, New Mexico, before it was super, 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 super popular to do. Uh, my father, when he got out of the Army of World War II, he, like many veterans, went to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and lived the life of a bohemian artist, and also got to know many of the makers, Maria Martinez and the extended family there. And so I grew up with pottery in my home in Northeast Ohio, which wasn't as common as you would think. So when I was preparing this PowerPoint, I thought, you know, these are very important influences that it just seemed normal to me that your grandmother would help some writer, or it just seemed normal to me that we would have beautiful pottery in every room of our home. So jump ahead about 20 years. I was born and raised in Ohio. I went to college in Ohio, and I married a guy from Ohio. And then we moved to New Haven, Connecticut, where he was going to medical school. And I knew that the arts was my direction. My father, who, as I mentioned, was a bohemian artist who became a scientist and then industrialist, would always take me to the Cleveland Museum of Art when I was a little girl. And so I started to work at the Yale Center for British Art in their education department. And we would devise tours for the Yale community, but also for the community of New Haven, which is a very different type of community. And so we were grilled in how we would present the stories about the artists who we were giving tours to, especially for the inner city school children of New Haven, Connecticut. And so, for example, this painting on the left is called Mrs. Abington in the role of Miss Prue, and it's by Sir Joshua Reynolds from 1771. And there are so many layers of information that we could tell and share with the students. And that became an art form. How did we communicate this kind of information to the urban city students of New Haven, Connecticut? And of course, one of the easier paintings to talk about, which was quite large, was the zebra done by George Stubbs. And both of these are 18th century paintings. And so not only did we talk about the artist, but we talked about how a work of art can live on and on and on beyond that which the person provided for them. So putting art into context, into a relational context, where people who might not be as well versed or informed could enjoy that process and gain information and hopefully some inspiration from that. So from New Haven, I moved to New York, or actually just north of New York, and was in graduate school doing two programs, a museum studies program and an art history program. And I also became the Hiller-Ribe Curatorial Fellow at the Guggenheim. And when I was there, I was working with the director of the museum and the curatorial staff on the Oskar Kokoschka retrospective, which was taking place there. And that's one of the self-portraits by Oskar Kokoschka. And I really like this view of the Guggenheim. That's the original architectural reality of the building before it got its addition, which dwarfs this, this rotunda area here. Working in the Guggenheim was a whole nother story, and it has lots of thrills, but it's also a challenging space. And then on the right here, I guess it's slightly covered by our panes of screens, is Hiller-Ribe. And she was originally from Europe and worked with forming the Guggenheim and establishing some of the collections that were there, particularly the Kandinskys. And what I absorbed from that time is that as a young woman in the art world, I have some breadth of navigation, and I need to maximize that as best as I can. So I was fortunate enough to work not only on the Oskar Kokoschka show, but I worked on a Joan Miró show. And I did writing in its most simplest forms, but not the most easiest. I would write didactic panels and short descriptions, which had to be very concise and user-friendly. So from the Guggenheim, I went up as a young curator to Sarah Lawrence College in Bronxville, and there was no escaping the influence of Joseph Campbell, who was a professor at Sarah Lawrence for a long, long time. He had since passed away when I got there, but the aura of Joseph Campbell and the celebration of Joseph Campbell was very much alive. And when I was there, Jacqueline Onassis did a reception for those who were fans, friends, believers in Campbell. And so many people were there, and he was celebrated as this transformative thinker who would be able to find stories of content in the everyday hero, so to speak. So I grew up in Ohio. I lived in New York and Connecticut, and then I moved to California across the country. And that was a big life change. And I think for many of us, we have one direction in mind, but in reality, we go a completely other way. And when I was in New York, I was getting my degree in early 20th century American modernist painting. And part of the reason I chose that was because I lived there. I lived in that area, and it made it very alive. I didn't have to find money to fly to Europe to study Renaissance, painting or Impressionist painting. I could do it right there. And I think that set a tone a little bit for my mindset. So I moved from New York with my husband to California, and I moved to a little town called Benicia, California, which is, for many of you, you may know, the home of Robert Arneson. And I knew a little bit about Robert Arneson, but not a lot. And as it turned out, we moved a block and a half away from his house. And so I would almost daily, I walked by Robert Arneson's residence with my infant son. I had 2 children living in Benicia. And these common moments evolved into an artistic direction that soon dominated my curatorial mindset. It was one of these, I don't think I could have planned it any better if I wanted to. We moved two blocks away. I would be walking with my son. You would see Robert Arneson walking his little dog. He actually had established a school for elementary students that we were considering taking our son to, but then we ended up moving out of Benicia. But you can still, his studio is still there, although it's not active in his work anymore. His widow, Sandy Shannonhouse, lives there. The Arneson Foundation is there. And it was just an undeniable connection. So because of the Loma Prieta earthquake, which was in 1989, my husband and I moved out of Benicia into Davis about a year later. And I became the director of what's called the Pence Gallery from 1994 to 2004. And many of you may know of the California Conference for the Advancement of Ceramic Art. Because I was the gallery director there, we always participated, we always curated shows, but I started to curate shows in general on ceramics, on artists who were using clay, not necessarily associated with this conference. And this was also when my vision for museums was manifest, and I transformed this Pence Gallery from a portable old dentist office building to the fine gallery it is today. And I attribute a lot of that to the visionary reality of someone like Hilary Bay. And I also, when I was living in New York and New England, I also realized how important smallish museums or galleries were to their community and how they could be dynamic and transformative. I remember seeing some beautiful John Marin watercolors that in New England that just was like, oh my gosh, these are fabulous. But they weren't big paintings. They weren't special exhibitions. They were just there as part of that collection. And I carried that with me when I moved to California. So these are just some of the exhibitions I did while I was there. And many of them went on to have realization in other venues like, well, the Toki collection of ceramic went on to a couple of different galleries. And I was able to produce some catalogs in association with that. The challenge, of course, was that it was a small independent gallery, and anything I did outside of the norm was a fundraising endeavor. As part of my role as the director and curator of the Pence Gallery, I really reached out into the community, not just in Davis, but in the greater Bay Area. And I got to know a family there in Berkeley called the Toki family. And they started a ceramic supply business in the late 1940s, right after World War II. And they are of Japanese heritage. So you might imagine that this was not an easy task to do, right in the Berkeley area. And it was in business for over 60 years. And one of the more fascinating components to it is that they became the resource for clay materials for artists from up and down the state of California. And on the left, you can see Leslie Toki, who is kind of the heart and soul of this business. And this is her son and well-known sculptor, John Toki, who wrote a major book on ceramic techniques and history. And she became quite beloved. And one of the things they would do for artists is if artists didn't have money to buy supplies, they would do trades. So they acquired a lot of artwork. This is Rayer Toki. And of course, this is Robert Arneson. And I've heard many stories from John about Rayer would help Arneson figure out molds and order molds for his sculpture. Here's Peter Volkes over here on the upper right. And again, that's with Leslie Toki. And John told me that oftentimes Peter would borrow their machinery, their truck or other things to haul artwork. And he was indebted to them and they loved him. And it was that way with many, many, many artists. And then on the bottom right here is one of the soirees that they would have at the Toki home in El Cerrito. And we have Viola Fry right here. And I think this is Vernon Kuykendall. And this is Ellen Gale Toki and the daughter, and Rayer Toki. And there are many, many stories about how the Tokis would have these soirees, and Jim Melcher would be playing the piano, or Ron Nagel would be playing the piano, and someone else would be doing printmaking in the garage. And it was one of these stories that I just felt so compelled to investigate. And all of this came out after I set my goal to tell their story, because when you'd go into Leslie Ceramics, there was artwork everywhere by artists from all walks of life. And that was a fascinating story. And in my book, I talk about that, how this family was crucial in helping artists experiment and develop their unique styles. So in addition to being the curator of this small gallery, I then was able to go to the Archie Bray Foundation in Montana to be the Gentile critic there. And the Gentile Foundation is in Banner, Wyoming, and the Archie Bray Foundation is in Helena. And they have partnered together to create an amazing opportunity for art writers, for ceramic writers, one which I will always be appreciative for. And so I spent 2 weeks in Helena interviewing these 5 artists, Joanna Powell, Adam Field, Seymour Pled, Tom Jaschak, and he's escaping me. They'll have to come to me. But they all, what would happen is they would all have a show both their first and second year of residency. And so this was for, I think it was after their first year. And they also get a show at the museum right there in Helena. And this was a really great experience. And one of the things I liked about this is they were all very different artists. They weren't all potters. They weren't all sculptors. There was this great variety. And then I drove from Helena to Banner, Wyoming. I see Mary Jane is on, and spent a month there writing in a beautiful writer's cabin, writing the essay for a catalog. So my experience as both a curator in Davis and becoming a more active writer, I was invited to teach the history of ceramics at California College of the Arts. And that was a bit of a daunting task because a legendary historian had been teaching it for years. And he had passed away and they couldn't quite find the right fit. And so I ended up actually teaching there for 6 or 7 years. And I decided I had some real latitude of the topics that I could teach. And I decided that there were still so many questions about the history of Northern California ceramics that's what I wanted to focus my class on. Most of the time I taught that. A few other times I changed the syllabus a little bit and had a different angle. But I did pioneer this course, A Century of Northern California Ceramics. And I taught it there for 6 years. And what was really wonderful, it was this in a similar way, it was the same decision why I chose early 20th century American modernist painting as my graduate thesis, because I was there and I could interview people and I could see their context and I could get a sense of their place within their context. And what was particularly wonderful is a lot of my students went on to be assistants in many of the studios of these artists. And while I was teaching at CCA, CCAC or CCA, they're both kind of the same, I was the director of the Richmond Art Center, which is just north of Berkeley. I was commuting down to the Bay Area from Davis. And this is a really interesting art center because it was designed in 1936 to be a civic art center, and it never had to adapt its space to be something else. And it has great exhibition spaces and classes and classrooms. And I did this show on the work of Stephen DeStabler. This was one of the last big shows that he had before he passed away. And this is the main gallery. There were a couple other galleries too, but it was right along this time where I was hoping to establish a ceramic study center there for a number of reasons, because of their location. And many artists of the Bay Area, who we all know, came through the Richmond Art Center in one way or another. And so here are a couple exhibition announcements, and you can see there's a Melchert show, a Richmond Art Center Bob Arneson show. And I love that announcement because I've seen a picture of him in his studio, and that announcement is thumbtacked on the wall right behind him. And then there's this contemporary Bay Area teapot show, and you can see that we have, Ernie Kim is there, and Jim Melchert, and Viola Fry, and Eunice Prieto. And then this is a picture of Peter Volkas working in the ceramic studio at the Richmond Art Center. And the Richmond Art Center was one of the locations that really swelled in population during World War II because of the Kaiser shipyards. And so it's changed and grown, and over 80 different languages are spoken in the public schools of Richmond. So it's a unique place, and I think it's an underappreciated venue. So while I'm doing all these other things, I always felt that it was crucial to capture the oral histories of these artists. And so I would do my research, and then I would ask, may I come and interview you? And no one ever said no. So I did. And in fact, Ron Nagel invited me to come back. I'll tell you about that. But I was able to interview every single one of these artists. Viola Fry at that stage wasn't tremendously verbal, but she let me walk around her studio and document her in her wheelchair. And that has always been a strategy of mine, is to not rely solely on what's said or what's written, but to take a visual record of the environment, of the artists at work or in their studio, because I feel that there's so much information there that we don't necessarily read about. And when I'm writing my articles, I try to thread that in because I feel that that is very important in terms of setting the context. The other thing about these pictures is most of these I've taken. So I have a documentation of artists in their studio, and I'm not sure what's going to happen to those. I'm looking for a place to give my archives to. But these are all, I think with the exception of Arthur Gonzalez, I've taken all of these photographs. This is Richard Shaw doing a demonstration at one of the clay conferences in Davis, Viola Fry at her studio, Stephen DeStabler at his studio on his hill where he just has cast-offs. This was a quick capture of Jun Kaneko down at the San Francisco Opera when he had designed the stage sets for one of the, I think it was Madame Butterfly. Ron Nagel, Jim Melchert, Wan Xin Zhang, and James Lavera, Ruth Rippon. And then I started, I've always been writing. I've always done a lot of writing, and catalogs, articles, and exhibition reviews. So what I came to observe about myself is, as I was developing a personal style and defining my voice, is I found that very practical things influenced my style. And writing the didactic panel developed my economy of the sentence. That was something that you had to be very concise with what you were saying. And then through the experience of life circumstance, it informs the professional artistic outcomes. And what I often found with my interviews and research is there are certain things that are said and they have some truth to them, but we needed to push further and we needed to find out more of the essence of that conversation. And I remember talking with Jim Melchert about the painting The Rose by J. DeFeo. It was done in the 50s in San Francisco, and I'd only seen it once in person. And I kept thinking to myself, it makes me think of clay. It makes me think of clay. It makes me think of clay. And so there are those kinds of intersections that might not necessarily be the goal of the interview process, but they certainly inform the ideas about it. And then the other thing I realized about myself in my interview process is I let the story broaden through the interview process. And sometimes, mostly it of course was about the artist, but there were times when we would have these tangents of conversation that were triggered by another outside influence that I got such great information. And so my afternoon with Ron Nagel was an example of that. I had not met Ron Nagel. I had the hardest time getting a hold of him. I finally got a hold of him on the phone and we kept getting disconnected. And so it was just setting itself up for disaster. I thought, oh, he's never gonna let me come talk with him. And so it finally works out, and I'm driving over to his home in San Francisco, and he lives up on a hill. I had never been there before. So I'm driving my car, and I go up halfway up the hill, and there's a stop sign. And I get ready to go the other half, and then my car starts to slide backwards, which was one of my greatest fears in driving in San Francisco, that you won't have brakes or that your car will slide backwards. And that is exactly what happened. My car was sliding backwards. I had no control. I couldn't get it to go forward. It was just, I'm going backwards. And so I put it in neutral. I don't know how I kept my cool. I put it in neutral, and at least I had my brakes, and I got it to the side of the road on a flat area. Just like, oh, that was like, I felt I lost 5 years of my life right then. But I still had this appointment to meet with Ron. So I collect myself, I grab my briefcase, I has my recorder in it, has my camera in it, it has a couple references in there, everything. And I literally hoof it to up this steep hill. And I finally get there and I'm just almost a wreck because I'm exhausted. I'm breathing, huffing and puffing, trying to get to his place on time. And I made it, right? So I ring the doorbell and there's Ron. He opens the door and he's holding his dog and his dog growled at me. And so that immediately kind of put any pressure off of me because he felt so bad that his dog growled at me, which is, dogs never growl at me because I'm a dog person, but this little dog did, the little dog that's in that picture of him. But what that did is we connected on this roller coaster of a day. And I spent the whole afternoon with him. And he loved my little digital recorder. I said, well, you know, I used to have a recorder that could only do 2 hours, but now I have like 60 on this. And so we just talked and talked and talked. And we looked at I told him I saw his show down in San Diego. And then we talked about the Albright Knox show that was there. And so I learned that he loved paint and that the Nabi were some of his favorite painters. And so all of that added a whole new dimension to Ron Nagel that I would have never imagined. And I found it very informative. So when I was in Davis, I did teach at UC Davis. I taught in the Museum Studies department. And I taught some basic courses on exhibition design. And so what does that have to do with writing? Well, I apply some of the same standards or guidelines of exhibition content that I do to writing content. Because when you have a basic exhibit, it's what you see is what you get. You could walk into an exhibit, be there for 10 minutes and walk out. Or you can provide more content with depth for an exhibition. So someone walks in, they show interest, something grabs their attention and they stay and they do a little bit more reading or experiencing or whatever. And then you have an exhibition with content with depth that moves the viewer forward. And that very simple set of parameters seems to have worked well for my work as a curator and a writer. Now, whatever that content is that moves the viewer forward is flexible. It could be more didactic panels, it could be a catalog, it could be a video, it could be some sort of installation. But the goal, I think, of a well-planned exhibit has those options. And it's not always forced down your throat that you have to follow all of the information that's available to you. But I often felt that we needed to provide options for the viewer. And I think that that is also very appropriate for my writing. So where do we go from here? I think that writing for the arts and for ceramics is challenging right now because there's such a complexity of communication formats, many of which are geared toward entertainment as opposed to scholarship. And I'm sure we've all come across those. And in a new era here, it's, you know, it's the slickest, the glitziest, whatever kind of blinks or sparkles or whatever. How does a text of content, how does a text of content compete with those? So I think in a way there has to be an acceptance that our practice as writers, we need to employ a dynamic practice by including original visuals and design. There needs to be something, and we're getting the tools, we have the tools to do that. We've got PowerPoint formats, we've got online publishing formats. We need to present the story through more than the written word. And then of course, funding especially is an important consideration. So fellowships with art and art entities like the Archie Bray Foundation and the Gentile Foundation and NSECA, I think, are some of the directions that we need to consider. Largely, for me, they were pivotal as an independent writer. I have been associated with universities in the past, and even getting grants for research in universities is extremely competitive. I've submitted proposals for great shows to museums, but museums, you know, they're very strict in what they can support. And what I liked about both the Archie Bray Foundation and the Gentile Foundation is that they're more equitable. They're interested in hearing a variety of voices that will tell compelling stories. And that's what I think is of interest to me. I've read a lot of really good academic publications, and I've participated in many academic publications. And I'm always happy to do so. But sometimes I walk away feeling that it was so formulaic, and I could have predicted what would have happened in this exhibition catalog or in this essay. And so for the Archie Bray Foundation, I wrote a small catalog for these artists called Ceramic Excellence, and that happens every year. There's another artist, there's another writer who comes in, spends time at Archie Bray, then goes to Gentile and creates a great presentation or a great documentation of the work of these artists, which then is very helpful to those artists. So one of the artists I wrote about for the Archie Bray Foundation was Zemer Palet. And of course, she's gone on to do great things, and they've reproduced my essay on a couple different number of occasions. So that's like a win-win-win. You know, the artists get documentation, the writer gets an opportunity, and they get funded for it. You know, the writer gets funded for it, and that speaks volumes. It speaks volumes. Then I wanted to also say that NCECA has started doing a fellowship called the Helene Zucker Seaman Curatorial Research and Critical Writing Fellowship for Women. And Heidi McKenzie from Canada has received that. And she's a practicing artist that talks about the narrative of her family. And it's quite interesting. And so when I think about where do we go from here, and which doors are open to ideas that aren't generated out of the organization, I look to places like the Archie Bray Foundation and NCECA, and perhaps the International Academy of Ceramics. I don't know if they have an actual a writer stipend, but I think I've advised a couple different organizations that if you want to get the word out about your organization, have a writing fellowship. Have someone who's a part of that and have them write for you. But also art fellowships in general. I guess these are the things that I benefited from as a young art historian and scholar, where I had those opportunities and I really ran with them, and it worked well for me. So in conclusion, I think that we all have a unique voice in this world of critical connections, of writing about art. I feel that my voice is that of a storyteller, where I tell someone's unique and amazing story and hopefully provide good documentation and new documentation. And that was what got me into writing about ceramics in the first place. Is I kept running into the same old stories, the same old documentation, and felt like there's a place for me to add to that dialogue. So, thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Great information there. And what I was struck by, as you initially started talking about your family and knowing where you've ended up, I'm struck by the depth and breadth of your family's contributions and the way in which that probably gave you a vast idea of your potential, of what was possible, which doesn't happen to all of us or many of us. And I can see where that would motivate and potentially give you the confidence to have that vision. And another thought that I had was, having been a professor in a medium-sized university, so many of the students are not willing. I mean, you've gone coast to coast. So many of the students are not willing to move like that. to
Mhm.
work with the best and to work with a variety of influences and realize that they will build layers of experience and knowledge that will ultimately turn into this personal vision that is valid. And I think those are things that we need to be encouraging students and young emerging writers to do. Um, and I'll open this up to comments and questions from everyone else.
I guess I'd like to both thank you, Nancy, very much. This was fascinating. And I have a comment and a question. One, I'm really fascinated by the photography paired with the dynamic writing. And the comment would be, I imagine you've looked at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, Sam's archives, that Mary Savage, who's now the curator at the Renwick, used to run. But offline or separately, I'll send you some info. The group James Renwick Alliance is supporting more archival documentation.
Oh,
If you haven't gone through Sam Renwick, because many of the artists that you focused on are all in the Renwick collection.
yeah.
So it seemed like a natural pairing. And I thank you for that. Also, I was a Gentile writer, and I just echo everything you said, how fantastic that was. My question is about writing in the pandemic or coming out of it, because you have such a personal style and that face-to-face meeting or camera in hand. How in a Zoom world, looking at art or connecting with interview subjects, has it affected, or have you pivoted, or have you made that your own? Because you seem to have a very special way to reach people and write about them.
It's been hard, it's been very, very hard. And I think everyone has had that hardship. I live now up in Truckee, California. I live at elevation 6,200. And so I've moved, from sea level of Benicia to like 60-foot sea level of Davis to 6,200. And I have to say that in a way, I worked very hard at being integrated and being active via Zoom. That was a lifeline for me. And I needed to be able to connect. And the other thing that I will say, and it might not seem real, but I've been working on this NCECA conference for 3 years. And every month I would be meeting with my cohorts at NCECA. Only one whom I had ever met in person. That was Josh Green. And all the other people I'd never met in person. And so it was a very, because we had to cancel our first conference a week, our 2020 conference a week before, and then we did our 2021 conference all virtual. It hit the ground running as a board member. And so that kept me focused. In terms of writing, I'm wrapping up my book that I've been working on for a long time. It's long coming, but that has also been very helpful to me to make sure that, and I consider good writing often as the result of a wrestling match, because I've never been a writer where things just kind of, I don't know any writers where things just kind of fall onto the page and it's beautiful and perfect and you've got everything assorted. I don't know that experience. And so I kind of had to wrestle. I had to wrestle with that. And it did get me thinking about my archives, because I have a lot of recordings. I have oral history interviews. I have all this photo documentation. We lost Clayton Bailey during this time, and I have so many photographs of Clayton Bailey that I don't know if anyone else does, and same with Jim Melchert and, Ruth Rippon and, all of these. And so that in and of itself was kind of my lifeline. And plus I could still get outside and walk around or ski, in the winter here up in Truckee. but I felt a little bit of a loss, not being able to, but I think we all did. I think we all probably felt that. So,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah. Anyone else have a question? Oh, come on. Linda.
Okay. Oh, I was just thinking they have a artist archive at the Nelson that they're really working hard on getting all of local, regional, every kind of paper, only paper information, whether it's catalogs, shows, reviews, any just about anything you can think of. So they're collecting the history of the artists regionally. I'm sure they have that in California at a museum, wouldn't you think? If not,
Well,
start one.
well, so I was telling Elaine that there's another woman out in California in my area doing similar but not exact work, and she also is from my little town in Ohio. So she and I were talking about how can we document and preserve a lot of these histories, and we haven't gotten much further than that. The one concern I have is that I think I would hate to, there's a lot of that. I sense there's a lot of that going on, and I feel like there's already something in place. One area I've thought about for my archives is the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley, because I used them a lot when I was writing my thesis. When I moved from New York to California, I had to finish my thesis, and I embraced a California topic. They now have a lot online, but I have thought about the Smithsonian. I know they have a criteria of evaluation, and so anyway, but in terms of getting back to Elaine's first comment about going from New York to California and that kind of thing, I was not of the generation where you had a plan. I was happy that I, found a wonderful partner, my husband. We both, I guess, were a little bit adventurous, and I always thought I would move back, because I didn't want to leave New York. I loved living in New York. I felt like I was a kid in a candy store. I worked, at the Guggenheim. I did some work at MoMA. I got to do condition checking of Van Gogh drawings, and I just was like, this is the best. I wasn't thinking that, I was thinking, we'll be in California for a few years and then we'll move back. But of course that didn't happen. But I did embrace where I was. And I wanted to tell the stories. And I do feel that we need to have academic integrity and scholarship. But I am very interested in the story that going a little bit deeper and maybe asking those questions that maybe an interviewer from this. I've read a lot of those oral history interviews from the Smithsonian, and they're very good, but they have the same kind of questions. And so I find that when you're willing to get in conversation with an artist, there's a lot of content there that comes out that might not otherwise have ever been known. So I guess I was super lucky that I got to live two blocks from Arneson.
That's true, happenstance. And the bringing up the pandemic has changed the dynamic, and it's a little bit of a double-edged sword in that we're limited on travel and all of that kind of thing. But it's also opened up the opportunities to work with people of stature, etc. But it's not hands-on. So we can Zoom with in a lot of opportunities, but it's not hands-on. So I don't know, we're going to be transitioning, we hope, back into where we can do that. And but look at Namita Wigger's program, which is all distance. I mean, they do have a residency component to it where the students go on to the campus, and she'll be our speaker in February. But still, it's a different kind of experience than no matter what level, you know, you can go in at entry level anywhere. I mean, you can volunteer your time and learn, but moving is to me is paramount. I've lived in 9 states and always have, to me, it's more about your attitude about where you are. And you showed that you didn't want to move, but your attitude is that it turned out to be just fantastic for you, you know?
Yeah, and I can't explain that per se. You know,
Mhm.
when I told this story to Sandy Shannon House, Robert Arneson's widow, it was just kind of, I was realizing how amazing that story was, and that story was my story.
Mhm.
And I just could not believe that that was me, that I had that journey. I have that journey still. So, and she and I, we both got a good laugh about it, but we also thought, you know, here's this girl who's born in Ohio and went to New York and
Mhm.
moved to California, and boom, I'm in the middle of, as Sandy said, you know, you were just in the middle of it all, and in a very real way. So yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I think, Rita, did you have a question too?
Yeah, I wanted to comment on your photography. It's just excellent. And it seems like you've added so much to these biographies of these people through a photojournalistic approach.
Yes.
It appears. I mean, you go there with a recording and a camera and just your whole persona ready to take everything in, instead of just writing about somebody's art from another state. And I think that's what's made what you're doing so successful. It has real connection with those people, and I appreciate it considerably. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate that very much. I always felt with my photography, the one thing I could appreciate, but I never was in love with, was the stage studio shot.
Oh no.
You know,
Yeah.
where the artist is there, you know, profoundly sitting, or, you know, in the, you know, sometimes smoking a cigarette. I just found those so pretentious. And I just wanted to be in an engagement phase with the artist. And so I was just with Aaron Toole down in Berkeley, and he's talking, and he uses his hands a lot to talk. So unfortunately, phones make things a lot easier, right? Some of those photographs were with my 35mm camera that had film, you know, that's so old.
Sure.
But, you know, phones now, I just said to Aaron, I'm going to pull out my phone and take some pictures. And he's talking, and he's not posing, and he's not pontificating. We're just having a conversation. And that is where my interest really lies, is the engagement, and not the, I'm the artist and you're the writer. It's an exchange that happens. And fortunately, in the conversations that I've had with artists, I've done my research. I had good questions. I also had questions I wanted to have answers to, but might not necessarily be the obvious question. And that's where I learned that the co-experience of the interview can create a whole new field of information. Like I said, when I was so stressed out, before getting to talk with Ron Nega, I was so stressed out. And the fact that his dog growled at me, and that was okay because it didn't scare me, but I knew it bothered him. So it put us at this kind of interesting place. And he suddenly became quite relaxed, and it gave me room to discuss and to ask questions and to have fun. And I also gave him, I had an extra catalog of the Funk Show done in 1967, and I had 2 of those. And I was doing research right before my interview. And so I had 2 of them, and I said, well, here, Ron, you know, here's a catalog. And he's like, oh, this is so great. You know, you can't find those. And so that kind of thing really, really did help. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
Yeah, and I wanted to just tell you a little bit about Rita. She studied with Dick Hay in Indiana for her undergraduate, and then has a degree from CU Boulder in photography. Is that correct,
Oh,
Rita?
wow.
Yeah.
And she and her husband do aerial photography now, but
Wow.
her interest in photography is
Okay.
very real. Yeah. So
Well,
Anna,
Unmute. So has there ever been an interview that just went like awry? Like just, I'm sure there was, but is there anyone that you're willing to tell us about and why that might have happened? And obviously you've had a lot of success with these interviews because you could see them, as Rita said, in the photographs and how you've captured people and in your writing. But I was just curious because inevitably there has to be, I always say there's always one, even in like a class I'm teaching, there's always going to be like the one problem student, or if I take a group to Italy or whatever, I'm going to have one there's always one problem. And I was just curious if you've had that like kind of difficult person or something that just went awry during the interview.
well, two things come to mind. One is, I think many of us have had this situation where you think your recorder's working and it's not. I've had that. That's painful. And I did have, there was one situation that took me a little while to recover from. I was visiting a very famous artist who has been in my talk. And I was with a friend of mine and I was going to interview his wife. And there's a long story about it, but basically we were knocking on the door and no one was coming. Then we pounded on the door, pounded on the door, pounded on the door. And finally you could hear somebody undoing the locks and the door swings wide open. And there's this extremely famous artist there, but he's in his underwear. And I'm like, I'd never met him before.
did you get a photo?
I did not get a photo. I mean, that's where I learned what the phrase sinking in your shoes means, because I was standing there and I just sunk in my shoes, because here's this person in his underwear right in front of me the first time I met him. And it was just so, and I said, and I tried to kind of gather myself and everything. And after that whole thing was over, I mean, we did ultimately interview his wife and everything, but it really did like throw me off. And at the end, my friend said to me, what, how are you doing? Or, I said, well, in a way, it's kind of like what my own father would have done, except for he would have had on red plaid underwear instead of blue. It was just such a startling experience. And it turned out to be memorable. I mean, I've never forgotten it. I've never forgotten it. And neither has my friend. So, but for the most part, there are those times when, like with the Ron Nagel, I mean, I was pretty exasperated and just, because my car rolling backward down the hill and everything. But for the most part, because I think I try to do so many different types of documentation, hopefully there's something to walk away with. And I try to do good notes after I'm done, but that's not always the case. I feel like there's so much information out there. I have so much information and I've documented so much information that for me to put out 80% of that would be a full-time archivist endeavor. But that's why I do photographs, because I feel that my notes might not survive, my oral histories might not survive, but hopefully my photographs will. And actually that brings me to a closing thought about what I do. So, and I'm sure Janet has had this thought too, because of her unfortunate experience with fire. But, I live in Northern California and we've had terrible fires. And I've already moved some of my family pictures down to my little place in Sacramento, but I have all of my books and I have all of my files and I have my my film archive. And so I'm like, what am I going to do about that? You know, and so I was talking to Martha Vita the other day, and I said, well, I'm going to take my film archives down, and I've backed up as much as I can on my computer. But that kind of, you know, how do we as documentarians and artists and writers, how do we deal with that threat of the loss of our lifetime of work? And that might be a very interesting discussion to have at some point. I think the Smithsonian was having a call for oral history approaches, new approaches to oral history. And I thought about submitting something. And I think that that's what I would have submitted, is how do we preserve, how does the independent oral historian, documentarian preserve their work in a time of kind of earth crisis and all that? I don't know. I don't have the answer. You do the best you can. Well, thanks, everybody. Thank you. Elaine, you're on mute, I think.
Yep, Elaine, you're on mute.
Oh, you just missed my brilliant words.
Well, you'll have to repeat them, I guess.
No, I just want to say thank you, Nancy, for sharing your story. I think it was inspirational, and it gave us a lot of information, but gave us also a lot to think about, and I appreciate that. So next month, I hope you noticed that next month we will be a week early. So we'll be the second week of the month instead of, it'll be the 14th instead of the 20th. And Diane Charnoff will be talking with us. She had an experience where she was able to mentor an undergraduate student writer for the newsletter that she publishes for the Smithsonian Renwick. And so she and I are going to stay on here after we're finished and hash it out a little bit more. So, and then you saw the remaining list of people that I'm working with and scheduling. So trying to get scheduled out a little bit farther. And anyway, I appreciate everyone coming, and we'll hopefully see you next month on the 14th, and I'll send out a reminder about that. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Elaine.
Thank you.